Lots of chat over here. I can see down in my hi everyone down here. I'm again trying to double up anyone who sees me looking up. I've got TikTok up here and I'm down here on YouTube, so I feel like I'm trying to double-hand it here. Um, but I can see that there is lots and lots of you in here. We have Kathleen from Huntsville, Alabama. Hey Liz, nice to see you here. Jeanette from Vancouver Island. Monica from Utah. Becky from Wisconsin. Becky, you may have spotted it. Hannah posted it up over on KnitHub that you are the winner of our first clue raffle. So that means that you can just send on a message to our email, to the shop email, and we can go ahead and send you out any pattern of your choice. So congratulations. Knox from Alabama here. Deirdre from Kildare, finishing the last few rows of Clue 2. Excellent, just in time. Liz, good morning from Jefferson City. You're excited to start Clue 2. And we have Wild Cottage Knitting in Clare. I'm looking down here. I don't think there's any questions popped up. As always, if you have questions about the clue, just pop them up here. And I've got a few ones that I've pulled in from the forum. But if there's something else kind of occurs to you as we're going through, just give me a shout. I think that a lot of the stuff gets covered over in the videos, but I know that perhaps you're not in Teachable or there's something that isn't quite covered. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. One of the things that has been popping up as well is just in relation to photos. It's always a tricky one with mystery knit-alongs. It's really hard because it's nice to be able to share, to have a place to share photographs, but not everyone wants the surprise spoiled if they're operating a little bit more slowly. We're trying to keep it consistent, but it is quite tricky. So basically what we're doing is in KnitHub, if you are going to be if you want to post a photograph in there, post it in the spoiler thread. So it'll say spoiler thread, put all of your photographs in there. To put that in, what you need to do is go down to the bottom where it'll say, what are your thoughts, or add your thoughts, where you add a comment. So add a comment and you can photographs and everything in there. When you create a new thread, if you go up and it says post and you click post and you put it in there, then anyone who's in the forum it'll pop up in their feed, and so they can't avoid seeing photographs if they don't want to. Obviously, when a clue is finished within a couple of days, it's fine to share because most people have finished. But I know that some people take their time, particularly more so on Clue 2, I think, because it's a much bigger clue, and so it's probably going to pop up a little bit more. But it is really tricky because we want you to be able to chat through stuff, which is why we put the spoiler thread up. So if you want to share photographs or get feedback or to be able to talk about the photographs that people have put up, that's the place to do it. Hannah's been great as well. She's made little spoiler images. So if you want to share it in social media or anywhere else, that way you can put that image up so it doesn't spoil the surprise. And then you can have it in the carousels where the other photographs are in there as well. Obviously, the mysteries are very short-lived because of the fact that you're really just talking about a couple of weeks, and we'll all know what it looks like. But I know that if you're operating more slowly and you like a mystery, it's nice to keep it going just for a little bit longer. So in case you've seen those threads, or if we've said, oh, we've moved it over to the spoiler thread, that's why. Just so that we can kind of preserve the mystery for a little bit longer. So we're on to Clue 2. I hope you're all looking forward to getting started with it. This one is getting taller and wider. Now, as you can see, because this is an actual triangle, you're just doing 2 increases every right side row coming up along like that. It doesn't get terribly wide. Extra width gets added at the end when you've got your lace edging all the way around. That will add it a little bit wider. But one of the questions that did come up is if you want to add more width but not more length, how do you go about doing that? Well, the best way of doing that is to go ahead and start working more increases as you work across. So normally, we've got this, all of our increases are yarn overs, 1 stitch in from the end at the start, and at the end of each wrong side row. And the reason it's on the wrong side row is because that's our knit row. So the yarn overs are a lot more straightforward to do in there. So that's where we've been putting our yarn overs in. Now, if you want extra increases, you could actually then, what I'd be inclined to do is just do a make one, but just you can do them maybe even on the right side. You can do a make one purl at the start and at the end, but I wouldn't do it every right side row. I do it maybe every second right side row. So that way it won't be a triangle. It'll start curving a little bit further out like this at the top. So it will change the shape a little, but what it will do is it won't add any extra length, but it will add extra width. Now, obviously, if you're doing that and you're not putting any more cables in, what you'll end up with is how you end up with a section, a lot more reverse stockinette stitch on each side. So if you're doing that, I would suggest that, I mean, I'll talk through this, where you're adding in cable, where is it? Cable 5, which is the start of extra cable 4. Normally you'll have one on each end, but you can add 2 so that it's going to be growing widthwise more as we go through. So I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I think there's a couple more questions popping up here. Shannon, you're wondering how much yarn to reserve for the edging. So I don't have the total yardage in my head. I think it was probably about 660 yards, something like that. And it was 400 yards per skein. So like you might actually even see as I'm going through with my knitting and I talk about where it was, I think it was about this much from the top where I ran out of the first skein. So there was probably another, I'd say 20 grams or so that I ended up using of that first one. So it was probably 440, 450 grams, or yards. Hang on a second now. 100 yards, another extra 10 grams at that point, and then the last bit. So then whatever the balance between that and the edging is the difference. It doesn't use as much in the edging because it's lace. And I know some people have been, if they've had a different skein of yarn, a different dye lot, or a different type of yarn, they're hoping to get the first part out of the first section and then the edging out of another. But if it's just one skein and one skein, you'll probably run out before you reach the end of the body. So I hope that helps a little bit. You've 800 yards and you'd like to make it a little bit bigger. If you want to make it a little bit longer, I'd say like I had, I know I've got it written down, but it was it didn't use the full 800. I went over 100 grams, so it was about 450 yards for the body, and then so it's about another 600. So it was a couple of hundred yards for the edging. If you go deeper, you're going to need to have a little bit more than that. But because the edging is worked outwards, you can, of course, keep going with that for as far or as little as you want. And that's another spot that actually works really well to add more size if you want kind of more width and more length at the bottom is the edging will actually work really well working a little bit wider. I have it sitting over here. My edging, I think, was like about this deep, but it will work. It's the kind of one that would also look really, really well with even a much wider edging than that. So that's another option as well. If you don't want to add extra length to the body, you can work it on the edging as well. And that also means that you can hedge your bets with your amount of yarn because you can kind of keep going until you run out, basically. Um, Liz, you've got 2 more rows and you're adding cable 5. Oh, fantastic. So I'm going to give you a little overview of the different cables now. So when we started with cable 1, and that was the entire chart where you start with your little twirl and it comes out like this. Then you've got your 2 knit stitches that continue as a cable out on each end, and they go all the way up. So they're there all the time. And then inside of that, you've initially got cable 2, which is just in the center. Now, when we move on to clue 2, what we're going to do is cable 3, and that's really what I kind of view as a joining cable. So the middle part of cable 3 will sit on top of cable 1, and then you've got an increase, kind of a loop, making it again look like it appears out of nowhere out on this side and this side. So that's what cable 3 is. It's setting up 3 different cables, the middle one continuing up from below, and then the new one starting at the beginning and at the end. So cable 3 is not very deep. Once you've done that, you're then going to go into cable 4, which is just it's a deeper cable, but it's smaller, and you'll repeat it 3 times. So it'll sit on top of each section from cable 3. Once that's done, you're going to finish, or you finish it the first time, and then when you're working through the next one, after row, I think it's row 12, it'll say it in the pattern. What you're going to do then is you're going to build out new ones. So very similar to what you did with cable 3, you're creating that loop, but this time it's a separate cable that's happening, and it's called cable 5. That will be over here on one side. Then you'll have your 3 repeats of cable 4, your section 1, and then you'll have another cable 5, which is again just a starting block, or the starting cable for opening a cable up out of nowhere. So then that will have your 3 middle ones here with cable 4, and you one at the start and you at the end. And so that will give you your 5 cable 4s for your section 2. And that's the one where if you're adding on extra increases and trying to make it wider, I would suggest working 2 cable 5s at the start and 2 cable 5s at the end. So that will mean that instead of having 5 cables going up, you'll end up with 7. So it'll fill up more space if you're adding a little bit extra width as you go along. So you're going to work those all the way up to the number of repeats. They can be repeated as you go, and you can also add more and kind of step it out as you're going, so that you've got cables continuing like that. And then the last thing you're going to finish with is decreasing at the very top, so the cables look like they're closing off, or it's becoming like a closed loop at the top. Because you know the way we increased at the bottom to open all of those cables up at the bottom, we'll do the opposite at the top of the cables and do decreases to make them look like they're disappearing into into nowhere. Out in they're completely disappearing, basically, is the idea at the top of it. um Barbara, you have just put in a lifeline. That's a really good idea. So I do have a video in showing you how to put in a lifeline. And when you're going from cable to cable, and if you're new to cables, then putting in a lifeline after very definite spots as you go through can be really, really helpful. So that if you change your mind about something, or you're like, I'd like more cables out there, you can take it off your needles, rip it right out, and then you have all of your stitches sitting on your lifeline. So it can make it much easier to change your mind and to rip back to a save point. It's like, I think of it like a game where you get to press the save point as you go back. So very, very handy. And Kathleen says, don't miss the P3s on cable 4. Liz is put stitch markers between each set of cables. Yeah, both of you are totally right. Do not forget the purl stitches between the cables. But when I was doing it, I am a big believer in stitch markers. So every one of those repeats of cable 4, I'll just put a stitch marker between each of those, even though there's just a few purl stitches in between. And it makes it much, much less likely that I'm going to forget one of those cables. So be very generous with your purl stitch, with your stitch markers. Actually, going back to talking about increases for the cable as you're going out, um, actually there's one more addendum to that. I was saying put increases at the edges. I wouldn't put them right at the edges. I would actually put them inside your 2x2 going on each side. So if you've got your 2 knit stitches, 2 sets of knit stitches going this way and this way, if you're doing extra increases, put them inside that, so that those ones are going to stay running up along the end. So I think that putting them outside is going to distort those cables, but putting it inside should, I think, work a little bit better. I hope that makes sense for anyone who was thinking about making it a little bit wider. And like I said, you don't have to do it with more cables. It's just that if you've got a lot more stockinette stitch, you're probably going to want to fill it with more cables. And you will have, it's kind of a double whammy in terms of the amount of yarn you'll use, because adding more width obviously will require more yarn. And if you add more cables, cables also eat up yarn very quickly. So it will also increase the amount of extra yarn you're going to need. So if you are intending on making it wider, do make sure you have plenty of extra yarn. Karen says the pattern calls for lockable stitch markers. Do you have to have lockable ones? Well, the reason I've called for lockable ones is I will often put the markers in on the rows before, so that I've got it set up as I'm going through. That's the only reason for lockable ones. If you're happy to put the markers in as you're getting ready to work the cables on that row, then standard ones will work. It's just, I will often find that I like to set the stitch markers up before I begin introducing cables so I can see where everything is. So I do have a couple of questions that I've got here. I think some of them might have answered. Gloria was saying, would I explain a bit more about adding cables for width without making it much longer? So hopefully my explanation of adding in little extra increases, but inside the edge cables, and then possibly adding more cables if you want to fill in the space. Hopefully that kind of makes sense as you're going along. The biggest thing is if you're changing stitch counts, just make note for yourself of how many increases you're doing, where they are, and all of that, so that, because you won't be able to use the stitch pattern, the stitch counts in the pattern, so you just should write it out so that you can track it as you're going along yourself. As we were going through, Antonia was asking during the yesterday about the progressions between cables 3 and 4, and I think I've kind of talked through that, so hopefully that makes sense. If anyone wants more explanation on that, just give me a shout. I think the main thing is cable 3 and cable 2 previously and cable 4 are the main cable block. Cable 3 is the setup and cable 5 is the setup when you're adding more. So if you think of it like that, it should make it a lot clearer to see what's happening. So if you're working cable 5, the reason you start that before you finish cable 4 is so that at the end of that, you'll be ready to start a new repeat of cable 4, and all of your new stitches will be ready to have those move on up on the outside as well. I've got Elaine was asking, you're interested in extending the size with the addition of more cables, but would that involve quite a bit more yarn? And the answer is probably yes. If you start adding more cables, you do want to make sure you've got a good bit more yarn. Even if you add more cables and you don't even add more width, because you still could do that because there is a little bit of reverse stockinette stitch on the side. I'd say you'd probably want a good extra 100 yards of yarn just for the extra cables to make sure that you've got enough space if you're adding them further up. So it is quite surprising how much yarn cables suck up. Where are we looking down here? Stacy was saying you feel like you should know this one, but on row 1 of cable 3, when you move your stitch marker 17 to the stitches to the left and the right before you begin, was that not correct? And I answered it in Knit Hub, but I'll just kind of call it out again here. So what Stacy, in the pattern, I say to put a marker 13 stitches before and 13 stitches after. And the reason for that is those 13 stitches are where that cable is going to move. It will eventually become 17 stitches because, like at the bottom, we'll start off with the make 2, which will have 2 increases. And then on the next row, the wrong side row, you'll have a make 1 purl on each side. So 13 plus 4 is going to bring you to 17. So it looks like it's 17 stitches from the chart, which is where it will end up. Before of those were increased stitches. So you're just starting off with 13 at the beginning of cable 4 and 13 at the end, and the rest all get added with those increases. Deirdre, if you knit per the design but want to use up the yarn of the edging, is there enough in the 2 skeins? Yes, there absolutely is, because I used about a skein and a half, so I had about 670 yards was what I used out of the 800 yards. So I stopped sooner than I could have. I could have gone further. I just decided I was going to leave it where it was. I was quite happy with the width, but you definitely have plenty of yarn to make it a good bit wider on the end. And I actually think if you're going to modify it, that's a nice way of adding it on, because it makes the edging a little bit more voluptuous, if you know what I mean, in the end. I've got Nina was saying, you're reading the pattern last night and you're unsure about cable section 1 and 2. So I'll talk about that again, because I was kind of saying how section 1 just means it's the first time you're doing the cable 4. So cable 4, you've got 3 repeats working through because it follows on for cable 3. So it'll be 3 sets of the cable. You work it once, and then on row 12, you start section cable 5, which is just a new setup on each end. When you finish cable 5, you've also finished the second repeat of cable 4, so bringing it to 2 repeats in the middle. And that means that when you go on to cable 4 again, which will be your section 2, you're adding 2 new ones. So now you'll have 5 all the way across. So I'm hoping that makes sense. It's much hard. This is the hard thing about the mystery shawl knit along, particularly something like a cable. I'm trying to describe what it is in words without being able to show you. So it's a bit like, because I've had a class many years ago where there was a couple of blind knitters in the class, and they took the patterns beforehand and they converted them into Braille. So they were reading the patterns in Braille through the class. But I became really, really conscious of the fact that when you can't show somebody and when you can't demonstrate with your hands, and all someone has to go by is your words, you have to be really careful about what your words say, and you can't misspeak as you're going along. So it was a real eye-opening experience for me, because I didn't realize how much I relied on my hands in demonstration. And the mystery shawls are the same kind of thing, is that you have to rely on my words, assuming you're not going into the videos, to actually see what's going on. I have to say, actually, going through KnitHub and seeing all of the photographs coming up, I'm actually in love with some of the ones in the darker colors, like the Becky, the one you have where the prize you won with the dark green. I just think it's fantastic. There's just something so rich about some of those Life of the Long Grass colors in the dark ones. And in particular, I don't have it over here, but you know, the Darnie in like their dark teals and their petrels. I Not great for me from a demo point of view, but from a wearing point of view, they would be really, really beautiful, I think, to see. Um, oh, thank you very much. I think your name is missing again here, but thank you for saying that you like my teaching. I do. I get a great deal of enjoyment from teaching and from explaining things and watching people have that moment where they go, ah, that's what you mean. It's very, very satisfying. And it's particularly when it's hard won, when it takes a while for someone to understand what's going on, and where it's a little bit confusing as you're going along. It makes it extra magical when when something clicks and they know what they're doing. There was something else I didn't have on my list here, but a couple of you were talking about it, about when you're doing cables and you've got a cable. I'll turn this way so I'm in the same way. When you've got the cable leaning to the left edge of that knit stitch has a tendency of getting loose. It's much more so than the other side, and there's a couple of different things going on. So the first one is, when you're going from a knit to a purl stitch, the edge of that knit stitch tends to get loose, simply because of the fact that when you are wrapping a purl stitch, it uses a little bit more yarn, and that extra yarn tilts into the edge of the knit stitch. Then I think just that action of moving the cables across this way just seems to loosen the edge of those knit stitches as you go. So I end up using a couple of different combinations to try and tighten it up. My go-to is for the first or second purl stitch after a knit stitch, I wrap the yarn the wrong way. So if normally, hang on, when you're knitting, you wrap your yarn this way, you wrap it in the other direction. So it'll feel very wrong. What it will do is it will make a backward stitch, but it uses half the amount of yarn. And then when you come to in the next row, you just correct the amount, but it makes it a smaller and a tidier stitch. The next one is just to be aware of your tension as you're going from a knit to a purl. And so as you're going to the purl stitch, just give the knit stitch a little tug to try and tighten it up. And the third one is, if it's a little looser, you've got two things that are in your favor here. One is it's shawl. So when you block it, you will be stretching it out, which will do you great favors because it'll even out a lot of those loose stitches on the end. And the other one is you can actually just pull some of the slack out of that stitch and move it into the adjoining stitches. So instead of having one that's a good bit looser, you'll have two or three that are just a little bit looser. So any combination of those are going to work. But it does the smaller cables, the looser gauge, and those left leaning cables, they do leave you a bit prone to having that edge stitch loose as you go along. Liz, you were saying the pattern's well written and it's hard to put into words, but once you reach it to a point, it falls in place. It does, it does. It's just, it gets there. And as you start seeing each one stacking on top of each other, it becomes very obvious what's happening. So often the words are harder than just following along. Since you were done with clue one, you picked up a 24 blanket squares. You have four done. It's a good chance to perfect cables. Absolutely it is. Yes. More practice with cables, the better. And with cables, I would suggest that if there's something that's annoying you, that if something doesn't look quite right, just slow down at that point and take a look at it. See what's happening. Why is that stitch getting a little looser? And just start troubleshooting as you're going through to see what kind of solutions you can come with as you're going. Irina, if you have to buy an extra skein to add with, would alternating skeins help deal with the different dye lot issues? Absolutely. If you got a hand dyed yarn, then you can just alternate your skeins every 2 rows and it's going to work really well. If you have two ones in the main body, then you should be able to go through and you shouldn't have any problems. Although any hand dyes, you're really going to always, I don't have two colors here, but like if any of these ones where you've got speckles and all the rest of it, every single one of these is going to look different. Whether there's no dye lots really with hand dyes because they'll put them into a vat, a batch at a time, but everyone is going to be speckled differently. Everyone's going to be in a different part of the pot. So there will always be variations. So with hand dyed yarns, you are best to always alternate every 2 rows for something like this because it's going to be obvious, but alternating it's going to work fine. It shouldn't just 2 rows with each one, and then that will blend any color differences you've got in, and you shouldn't have any problems. Um, but yeah, I'm looking at this one. I think this I would love even a cardigan in this, like the Citrus Dreams cardigan in this one and the plum. Wouldn't that be gorgeous? Yes, I'm a danger leaving piles of yarn next to me. My eyes are bigger than my hands. I can't knit enough to be able to knit all of the things I want to knit around here. It's one of the torturous things about working in a yarn shop is that there is never enough time for all the yarn you want to knit. I think I've probably answered most of the questions that have popped up. So if there's anything else that does come up or you're watching it afterwards and you have a question, put it into the comments down below here and I'll pop in. Next week we will be back again here where I'll be talking through clue 3, where we get to talk about the very final section. Do not worry if you're still working on clue 2 by the end of next week. I won't be showing anything. I'll be talking about what's coming up in clue 3 so you can listen in and get ideas. But clue 2 is a lot bigger than clue 1, so be gentle with yourself and do not worry if you do not get it done by next week because it's a lot of knitting in a week. So take your time, enjoy the knitting, and there is no rush. We'll all be here whatever time you finish the shawl at. So enjoy your knitting and have a great weekend, everyone. All right, I will say goodbye to